I never thought I would be sitting in my own living room watching my daughter measure the width of my front doorway while her husband stood in my kitchen making notes on his phone. I was 68 years old. I had lived in that house in Orangeville, Ontario for 31 years. My husband and I had bought it the spring before our youngest was born, when the maple tree in the backyard was still small enough that you could wrap both hands around the trunk. He passed away 4 years ago, and after that, the house became something different. Not just a place I lived, but the place I was still him, somehow. His boots were still by the back door. I never moved them. I had my life. I want to say that clearly, because later, when everything happened, people assumed I had been lonely, or confused, or somehow easy to manipulate. I was not. I volunteered at the Dufferin County Museum on Thursdays. I had a book club that met every second Tuesday at the library branch on Broadway. I drove myself to my medical appointments, maintained my garden, shoveled my own front walk until the winter of my 67th year, when my back said firmly that this particular era was over. I hired a young man from down the street to do it after that. His name was Tyler, and he always knocked to let me know he was done, and sometimes I gave him tea. I was fine. I was more than fine. My daughter lived in Mississauga with her husband. They had 2 boys, 12 and 9, and a house that was too big for them, and a mortgage that I knew, though she never said directly, had become a pressure. Her husband worked in logistics. She had gone back to part-time work after her second boy was born and never quite made it back to full-time. Money was a current that ran under everything they said, not visible, but always there, pulling. She started calling more often in the autumn, October, November. Checking in, she said. Just wanted to hear your voice, she said. She asked whether I had anyone to help with the gutters, whether I was eating properly, whether the furnace had been serviced. Small questions, caring questions. I appreciated them. I answered honestly, and I felt grateful that she was thinking of me. Then in December, she drove up with her husband for a weekend visit, and somewhere between Friday dinner and Sunday morning, the tone shifted in a way I felt but couldn't quite name. Her husband kept walking through the house with this particular expression, not admiring exactly, but assessing. He looked at the ceiling in the upstairs hallway where there had once been a small water stain, long since repaired. He looked at the kitchen counters. He opened the door to the unfinished basement and stood at the top of the stairs for a moment without saying anything. At dinner on Saturday, my daughter mentioned, carefully as though she had rehearsed it, that the real estate market in Orangeville had been strong. A lot of people selling, she said. Good prices for older homes, not that she was suggesting anything. Just interesting. I said it was interesting and changed the subject. But they came back in January, and then in February. Each time something small was different. Her husband brought a measuring tape the second visit. He said he was thinking about whether a wheelchair ramp might ever be necessary. Just planning ahead, he said. Very thoughtful. My daughter started sending me articles about seniors who had falls, about the difficulties of winter driving at a certain age, about communities designed for active older adults, as the brochures always called it, where everything was on one level and there was programming and a dining room and staff available around the clock. I read the articles. I did not respond to them. Then, on a Tuesday evening in March, she called, and she wasn't carefully casual anymore. She was direct in a way that took my breath away. She said she and her husband had been talking, seriously talking, and they were worried about me being alone in that house. She said the upkeep was a lot for one person. She said they had found a very nice retirement residence in Brampton, only 40 minutes from them, she added, as if proximity to her was the thing I would find persuasive. I told her I wasn't interested. She said she understood, and then she kept talking anyway. Over the following weeks, the calls continued. Her husband began calling too, which he had never done before. They came up again in March, and this time they brought the brochure, printed and glossy, as though I might be more convinced by paper I could hold. The residence was called Brookfield Gardens. There was a photograph of women laughing over a jigsaw puzzle. There was a photograph of a man in a cardigan walking beside a path lined with flowers that were too perfect to be real. I told them again that I was not going. but I noticed something had changed in how they spoke about it. It was no longer framed as a question. It was framed as a plan being worked through, as though my agreement was a detail to be resolved rather than the entire basis of the decision. My son-in-law began talking about the house in terms of what it could yield. He said the words equity and market timing and carrying costs. He said that the money from a sale could set me up very comfortably, pay for years of care, and still, and he said this carefully, leave something for the family. I understood then what he was actually saying. I did not let my face show that I understood. That night, after they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time with my tea going cold in front of me. I thought about the boots by the back door. I thought about the maple tree, which was enormous now, which threw shade across the whole yard in July. I thought about what my husband would have said, and I knew exactly what he would have said, because he had been a plain-spoken man from Bruce County who did not have patience for people who dressed self-interest up as concern. He would have said, "They want your house." And then he would have said, "So what are you going to do about it?" I called my friend Vivian the next morning. Vivian was 72 and had been widowed 6 years before me and had navigated her own version of this particular education, and she was the least sentimental person I had ever met, which was exactly what I needed. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she said, "You need a lawyer, not the family lawyer, not anyone connected to them, someone who does elder law." I had never heard the phrase elder law before. I looked it up that afternoon. There was a woman practicing in Orangeville, a small firm on First Street. I called the next morning and made an appointment for the following Thursday, between my museum shift and my book club. Her name was Patricia Johansson, and she had short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the particular quality of someone who had heard a great version of this story before and was not surprised by any of it. She asked me questions for an hour. She explained to me, in very clear language, what my rights were. She explained what a power of attorney meant and what it did not mean, and what I should and should not sign under any circumstances. I came home from that appointment, and I sat in my living room, and I looked at the house differently than I had in a long time. Not as a burden or a problem or a thing to be managed. As mine. My daughter called that evening. She said a real estate agent had agreed to come and do a free assessment of the property value. She had taken it upon herself to arrange this. She said it wasn't a commitment, just information. I said that was fine. The agent came the following week. He walked through the house with a practiced efficiency that I found oddly calming. He told me what comparable properties were selling for. He gave me his card. After he left, my daughter's husband called to ask what I had thought. I told him the assessment was useful information. He seemed encouraged by this. Over the following 2 weeks, papers began to arrive. First, a letter from the real estate agent formalizing his services. Then, a document my son-in-law had couriered to the house, which he described on the phone as just preliminary paperwork, standard procedure, nothing to worry about. I read every word of it. Then I scanned it and emailed it to Patricia Johansson. She called me back within the day. She explained what the documents actually said. They were not nothing. They were not preliminary. Among other things, they contained language that would have given my daughter and her husband significant authority over decisions regarding the property, structured in a way that would have been difficult to contest later. I asked Patricia what she recommended. She told me. I thought about it for 2 days. I called Vivian and told her what Patricia had said. Vivian was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Well, you always did like a good ending." I signed the papers. Not the ones my son-in-law had couriered. I signed different papers entirely, documents Patricia had prepared, which did something very specific with the property that I am going to explain in a moment. But first I want to tell you what it felt like to sign them. It felt like the first quiet morning after a long noise. Like when the furnace stops running and you didn't know how much you'd been hearing it until the silence came. My daughter called to ask if I had reviewed the preliminary documents. I told her I'd reviewed everything carefully and that I was comfortable moving forward. She was very pleased. Her husband called an hour later, and he was very pleased too. They made arrangements to come up the following weekend to discuss next steps. I made my spare room ready, as I always did. I baked the oatmeal squares my daughter had liked since she was a girl. I put fresh towels out and I brought in flowers from the garden. They arrived Saturday afternoon. We had a very nice dinner. My son-in-law poured the wine with an expansiveness that I now recognized as the particular generosity of someone who believes the difficult part is behind them. My daughter talked about the residence in Brampton, about the activities, about how we'd be able to visit so easily. She had clearly been thinking about this in great detail for a long time. I listened. I asked questions. I refilled the breadbasket. On Sunday, they said they wanted to drive over to the residence. Just to have a look, see the space, not a commitment. I said I would come. We drove to Brampton in 2 cars, and I walked to Brookfield Gardens, and I nodded at appropriate moments and asked about the dining room hours and the parking situation for visitors. The woman giving us the tour was very practiced and warm. In the car on the way back, my daughter reached over and squeezed my hand. She said, "I think you're really going to be happy there, Mum." I squeezed her hand back. That week she called the real estate agent and told him to proceed. She emailed me the listing agreement to sign. I called Patricia and then I signed it. I want to be precise about what I had done because the details matter. Working with Patricia, I had executed a legal arrangement, structured before any of the sale documents were completed, which transferred the beneficial ownership of the property into a trust. The trustee was me. The beneficiary, for the duration of my lifetime and at my discretion, was also me. The house could not be sold without my direct, separate, independently witnessed authorization. The listing agreement my daughter had sent me was, in the context of this arrangement, functionally meaningless. The agent could list. What he could not do was close. Additionally, Patricia had filed a notation on title at the Land Registry Office in Barrie. Anyone doing due diligence on a purchase, any competent real estate lawyer on the buying side, would find it immediately. The listing went up. I watched it from the outside, as it were. My daughter sent me excited texts about the showing requests. My son-in-law started talking about timelines for my move to Brookfield Gardens, about what furniture I might bring and what might go to storage. An offer came in 3 weeks after listing. It was strong. The market in Orangeville was exactly as my son-in-law had said. My daughter called me, barely able to contain herself. She said the offer was wonderful. This was wonderful. Everything was coming together. I said it did sound wonderful. The offer was accepted, conditional on financing and inspection. Both conditions were satisfied. A closing date was set. The buyer's lawyer began the title search. She found the trust notation the same afternoon. I learned later, through Patricia, that the buyer's lawyer had flagged it immediately and contacted the listing agent, who had contacted my son-in-law, who had contacted my daughter, who had called me in a state I had not heard from her since she was 15 years old and had missed her curfew. She said there must be a mistake. I said there was no mistake. She said she didn't understand. I told her, calmly, sitting at my own kitchen table with my tea, looking out at the backyard, that I had arranged for independent legal advice several months ago, and that on the advice of my lawyer I had taken steps to ensure that my property could not be sold without my explicit ongoing consent, and that I was withdrawing that consent. There was a long silence. She said, "But you signed the papers." I said, "Yes, I did. I signed a listing agreement. I did not sign a transfer, beneficial ownership, or revocation of the trust. My lawyer can explain the distinction if that would be helpful." She said, "Mom." I said, "I know, sweetheart." She cried. I sat with that. It was not easy to sit with. Whatever else was true, she was my daughter, and I had raised her, and I knew exactly the sound of her crying, had known it since the first hours of her life. But I also knew what they had been planning. I had the emails she'd sent the real estate agent before she had ever spoken to me about this. I had the conversation I had recorded. Legally, in Ontario, you may record a conversation to which you are a party, in which her husband had discussed with some precision how the proceeds would be allocated. The sale collapsed. The buyers walked away. My son-in-law called me 3 times that evening. I let the calls go to voicemail. His messages began professionally and ended somewhere else. I called Vivian that night and she came over and we drank tea and she said very little, which was exactly right. In the weeks that followed, there were difficult conversations. There was a period of silence. My daughter eventually called, and what she said, not all of it, but the part that mattered, was that she had told herself they were doing what was best for me, that she had believed or had worked to believe that I truly couldn't manage alone, that the house was too much, that this was about care. I think some part of her had believed it. I also think the believing had been made easier by the fact that it coincided precisely with what she and her husband needed. I told her I understood that. I told her that understanding it was different from accepting it. We are still finding our way back to each other. Some things do not return to the shape they had before. I have made my peace with that. What I have not made peace with, what I don't intend to, is the idea that being old means being manageable, that loving someone gives you authority over them, that a woman who is 68 and lives alone and whose husband is gone is therefore available to be organized, arranged, and cashed out for someone else's benefit. Patricia Johansson sent me a card after everything was resolved. It said, "You knew what you needed to know. That was the work you did." I have it on my refrigerator. Tyler still comes to shovel the walk. The maple tree came through the winter fine. The boots are still by the back door, and on the particular days when the light comes through the kitchen window at a certain angle in the late afternoon, I don't feel alone in the house at all. I am 68 years old. I live in Orangeville, Ontario. My name is Beverly Crane, and I am still very much here. There's something I keep coming back to, even now. Not the papers, not the trust document, not even the phone call with my daughter that left us both silent for a long time. What I keep coming back to is the measuring tape. That image, her husband standing in my front hallway with a measuring tape telling me he was planning for a wheelchair ramp, says everything that needs to be said about how this began, not with cruelty exactly, with a story they told themselves. A convenient story, the kind that lets you want something for someone else and for yourself at the same time, and never quite have to look at the difference. I've thought about what I did wrong in those early months, and the honest answer is that I was too trusting for too long. Not naive. I felt the current underneath the conversations. I just didn't want to believe it was going where it was going. That's its own kind of avoidance, and it cost me time. The lesson I carry from that is simple. When someone you love starts reframing your life as a problem to be solved, it's worth asking early whose problem they're actually trying to solve. What changed things was not anger. I want to be clear about that. I was angry, yes, privately, on the nights when I sat alone at my kitchen table and understood what was being planned. But anger on its own doesn't build anything. What built something was the decision to act from a clear head instead of a wounded heart. I called Vivian. I found Patricia. I read the documents. I asked the questions I needed to ask. None of that is dramatic. None of it makes a very exciting story, honestly. But that's where the actual work happened. In the ordinary, unglamorous business of informing myself and then acting on what I knew. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't issue ultimatums. It just quietly does what needs to be done and waits. I'm not sure I would have called it courage at the time. I would have called it stubbornness, maybe, or just a refusal to be organized out of my own life. But I think it was more than that. I think it was the accumulated result of 68 years of learning that I was the only person who could be the final authority on my own story. What I want anyone watching this to take away, especially if you're in a situation that feels even a little like mine, is that your instincts are real data. If something feels off, it probably is. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to take time. You are allowed to consult someone who has no stake in the outcome. And you are allowed to change your mind about what you're willing to accept at any point, regardless of what you've already signed or said or agreed to in a moment when you didn't have the full picture. The boots are still by the back door. The maple tree is enormous now. Patricia Johansson's card is still on my refrigerator. I'm still very much here, and I intend to stay.